Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 5. We'll be talking about political participation, public opinion, and polarization. Today, this week kind of marks our shift away from the more abstract theoretical work that we were doing, the kind of conceptual stuff at the beginning in terms of collective action problems and rational choices, as well as the more historical focus, moving into what we might think of as political science more proper. This first lecture is focusing on public opinion. Our goals are to describe and define it, to identify some of the challenges in measuring public opinion, as well as some of the challenges of public opinion in a democracy itself. We're going to start by kind of moving through where our public opinions get formed from, how we measure, and some of the challenges, and then thinking about the quality of public opinion and what role that might play in democratic politics. So, what is public opinion? Well, the political scientist VOK gave us this super helpful and very specific definition of those opinions held by private persons which governments find it prudent to heed. Now, this is probably one of those frustrating definitions that doesn't really say anything, but it's actually kind of useful because public opinion itself changes depending on what's at stake and what issues are matter. And so, the public's opinion on some particular issue area, like environmental policy, might not have been particularly salient before the 1970s and the rise of environmental policy at the federal level. So it's whatever kind of the people as a whole think or believe about politics that politicians should be attentive to. And this is really important in our idea of a representative democracy. Representatives can't be responsive to their constituencies if they don't know what those interests are, right? So we think that this is particularly important. So how do we know what these opinions held by private persons? Oh, before we get to that how we know question, sorry, but it's important to think about the kind of interrelation between public opinion and politics. And your textbook goes into more detail here and that in the politics of public opinion chapter. But we can think of both public opinion affecting politics and politics affecting public opinion. Right. So if we're thinking in Congress, for example, representatives and senators respond to shifts in public opinion or risk re-election. Some of this, as your textbook notes, some of the scholarly evidence on this suggests that members of the House of Representatives are more likely to shift their own stances to follow public opinion because they have a bit more of an incumbency advantage, where senators tend to get replaced. That if there's a big shift in public opinion where the senator is on the wrong side of the issue, they are more likely to be replaced than themselves shift their opinions. Um, the president's agenda doesn't so much get shaped by public opinion, and this is because of term limits, right? They're not going to be running forever. It's a nationwide elected office, but it does strengthen or limit the ability of the president to get their agenda, right? If an unpopular president is going to have a harder time convincing Congress to get things done, where a more popular president is going to kind of create more electoral pressure on Congress from the popularity in the public. And the evidence on the effect of public opinion on the Supreme Court is fairly mixed. There's some evidence that they respond to shifts in public opinion, especially on which cases they will hear. And there's some, but it's not super robust in terms of like what they will rule. Part of this is because they have lifetime appointments, they're not respond, which is the whole point of them, is that they're not responding to shifts in public opinion. But public opinion also is affected by politics. We can think of the idea of the president's bully pulpit. The president can go and make a speech about an issue and bring it to light. People might not care or about the issue until the president gets on television and starts talking about it. Congressional agenda setting, right? What bills, policy initiatives or activities, including like oversight hearings, Congress is engaging in will shape kind of what the public thinks. And the Supreme Court also work as a shaper of public opinion, right? This when you, especially big high profile cases, like Roe versus Wade or Brown versus Board of Education or in other cases can kind of shape what people think about issues. So where do we get our opinions from? Well, at the individual level, they come from both beliefs and attitudes. Beliefs are these closely held ideas that support our values and expectations about life and politics. These beliefs can be anything from the I believe in small government and lower taxes, or I believe that equality is an important political value. I think that free trade is bad or good, or what have you. Attitudes, on the other hand, are more kind of fluffy or nebulous. These are the kind of preferences that we form based on our life experiences and our values. And together, we can also think of interests kind of forming from these beliefs and attitudes. That what are the kind of material and social goals, preferences, and values that one seeks to achieve in politics? But these are only at the individual level. Where do these beliefs, attitudes, and interests come from? One answer is ideology, which we can think of as a more general picture or framework that someone uses to understand the political world and integrate these particular beliefs, attitudes, and interests as well as weigh their competing values. So to kind of flesh this out a little bit, you've probably all seen this political compass idea where the y-axis ranges from like preferences for order towards preferences for freedom, and the x-axis focuses on preferences for a more planned economy versus a more market economy. And then we can kind of have these ideologies, right, that fit together particular beliefs about laws, right? If you have a liberal ideology, then you're going to prefer the existing social order, but you're going to prefer a market economy, etc. Um, and, if you have a more socialist ideology, you're going to prefer more elements of a planned economy, more wealth distribution. So these beliefs and attitudes are going to be kind of fit together into a coherent picture. Now, in the United States, the words liberal and conservative and socialist and libertarian all kind of get thrown around a lot. But at least in mainstream politics, most politicians kind of operate in this realm of um, liberalism. Now, there's left and right liberalism, right? Like, I'm not going to say that Obama is the same as Trump or that Bush is the same as Sanders. But there is it is kind of operating most mainstream politicians within the kind of realm of liberalism, more conservative or more socialist leaning liberalism, or more conservative or more um, kind of progressive leaning liberalism. Kind of, we can do a left right a top down thing, but we're all kind of in this same bucket here. But are these individual beliefs, attitudes, and interests also come from processes of political socialization? So things like our parents and our family. There's pretty good evidence that one of the biggest influences on our political ideology and political interests come from our family. Also from informal networks, clubs, organizations, churches, peer groups that are the people that we're talking to are going to kind of shape what we think about. And also the media, both traditional and social media, is going to kind of socialize us to encourage us what we think. Um, so this is some evidence looking at the kind of political socialization within families. So if both parents are Democrats, it's more than likely that their children will be Democrats, right? Either ranging 31% chance they'll be strong Democrats, but more than 50% chance that they will be some form of Democrat, and less than a 20% chance that they will become a Republican. And we see similar things on the flip side. If both parents are Republican, there's less than a 20% chance that the children will become a Democrat. And if there's inconsistent partisanship among the parents, right? If one parent is a Republican, one parent is a Democrat, then you kind of see it's relatively even across the board. So how are we going to know what the public thinks? Well, usually we ask them in public opinion polls, but there's all sorts of challenges to measuring public opinion using polls. And the biggest one is the question of sampling bias. Sampling bias is when the polled, because you're not going to poll all 300 million Americans to see what the population as a whole thinks. You're going to poll a few hundred or maybe a few thousand. But if you only poll people who think one way, you're not going to that's not going to tell you what the population as a whole, what the country as a whole thinks. It's going to tell you what those 300 people think. And so one way that we want to make sure that we have a representative sample, or when the sample has similar demographic distributions to the overall population as a whole, that we have the relative number of Republicans and as Democrats in the sample as we do in the population as a whole, men and women, people of different races and ethnic groups, people of different age groups, different education levels, different wealth levels. And one way we can do this is through a random sample. And this is selecting a sample in which everyone has an equal chance to do it. And this is fairly easy to do, right? We just kind of use a random number generator that randomly dials different phone numbers or randomly emails out polls. And we randomly select our sample so that there's no systematic bias. We're not like only polling Republicans. We're not like calling a list of people who voted for Donald Trump and only polling them, right? But a random sample isn't necessarily a representative sample. So what pollsters often do is they use weighting, right? That random can get us close, but then we want to use weights to adjust it, right? So if we end up randomly selecting 10% more Republicans in our sample than there are in the general population as a whole, we are going to weight the responses we get from Democrats slightly higher to try to balance that out. But we can also have challenges from the realm of question bias. There can be ambiguities in the meaning of the question, right? It could be people might not. The question could be worded in such a way where people aren't able to accurately express their opinions on the issue with the answers that they give. They could also be framed questions, right? This is the idea of the push-pull, right? You can have the idea of that you frame an issue in terms of you frame an issue about protests in terms of free speech. You might get different results than if you frame an issue about protests with the language of like public order. Also, there's if there is a don't know or not sure option, if there isn't one of these options, people will often answer questions based on things that they actually have no knowledge of because they don't have the option, but that they don't know. There's also the idea of desirability bias. This is also known as a Bradley effect, that people don't want to be judged for having socially improper opinions. So they might, because they're talking to a real person, they might not give their real opinion on something, especially a controversial issue. And there's also the idea of reflexivity, that attempting to measure public opinion actually shapes it, that some people might not have actually thought about an issue until you ask them to. So you're not actually asking the question, but you are shaping it. And the poll themselves, when people see, oh, 70% of people agree with this, I didn't have strong opinions before, now on this issue, so now I agree with this particular position. So we can use this to help us think a little bit about what went wrong in 2020 from that article in your reading. There's the question of the hidden Trump voter. This isn't the idea that Trump voters lied to pollsters, but that the Trump coalition, because of President Trump's own kind of language of own distrust of the media, that Trump voters are less likely to be responsive to mainstream polls. If like the New York Times or ABC News or CNN calls you up and you think that these are all fake news, you might not answer their poll questions. There's also the idea that the resistance might have been overrepresented, that politically active people are more likely to respond to polls than politically inactive people, and that the kind of burgeoning political activism against Trump might have overrepresented more more Democrat-leaning individuals. There's also concern that the polls did not accurately capture turnout, and that COVID affected response rates. That many Democrats with in higher education, for example, or in other kind of like white collar jobs that we might not have actually captured. They were able to work from home, might have been overrepresented because they were responding to more polls than we might not have actually captured the country as a whole. There's also lots of questions about how representative the Hispanic vote was in these polls, especially given Trump gains in the Hispanic community, or at least certain segments of the Hispanic community. So, in general, what is public opinion like? Well, it's not great. It's in general uninformed, that people are relatively uninformed about basic political facts, and this is the idea that they are cognitive misers, that gathering detailed and complex information about something like regulations of the financial sector takes significant time and energy, and that there's a high opportunity cost, that you could be doing literally anything else, right? And so people are unlikely to spend their time learning about politics. It's also inconsistent that polls find that people over time will often significantly change their views. Zoller, the political scientist John Zoller in 1992, finds that when people are responding to surveys, they're often kind of visceral expressions of subjective sentiments, right? Especially if it's a controversial issue in the news rather than rationally thought out answers. They're also incoherent. They're not consistent across issues. This can be illustrated by what's known as Fino's paradox, which is the idea uh, that Congress as a whole has abysmally low approval ratings, but individual representatives are often held very high approval ratings, and most incumbents get reelected. It's also not ideological. It doesn't represent clear ideological priority or consistency. In a 2008 poll, 44% of Americans did not view Republicans as more conservative than Republicans. More conservative than Democrats, and 16% thought that Democrats are more conservative than Republicans. So people aren't always thinking ideologically. No, this creates what's known as the democratic dilemma, one that the founders were aware of. And this is the idea that if people are supposed to be the source of political authority, what if they don't know what they're talking about? Walter Lippmann, in his book 1925, The Phantom Public, called this the idea that there's a challenge when, like, what if the public doesn't actually want anything or doesn't want something consistently? Where do we get legitimacy in democratic government from? William Riker in 1982 argued that there's like no such thing as the general will. There is not, because public opinion is so incoherent and inconsistent that we can't kind of say that the public as a whole wants something. So there are a couple of solutions to this. Benjamin Page in a 1992 work, The Rational Public, argues that even if at the individual level public opinion is all over the place, if we aggregate public opinion, it's relatively stable and it shows a rational response to changing events. A similar study at a similar time by Stinson, that your book talks about, called Public Opinion in America, said that you can discern the general mood of the public by analyzing multiple surveys. So if you get a big enough survey, you will actually get more consistent issues rather than looking at the micro level. In 1998, political scientists Lupia and McCubbins argued that we can solve the democratic dilemma with heuristics. And these heuristics are cognitive shortcuts that simplify the complexity of the world and help people make decisions. So we don't need people to necessarily be experts on every aspect of policy, as long as they're making good decisions based on trustworthy shortcuts. And some of these heuristics are things like party ID, right? If you are a Republican, even if you don't know everything about the different candidates on the ballot, you will likely to vote for the Republican. It's simplifying the amount of thinking that you have to do. Similarly, elite cues, so endorsements from elites, or social networks, and so we rely on the opinions of others. And so the question is, like, if these heuristics are relatively good, right, if they're not manipulating people into kind of voting against their interests, that we don't need each individual person to be an expert on every aspect of public policy. So that's it for our kind of intro to public opinion. There's a lot more to talk about here. You can teach whole classes on public opinion. But in our next lecture, we're going to be shifting gears and talking about partisanship and polarization, both like what is polarization, what are the causes of polarization, and is it as bad as everyone says it is? So that's it for this lecture. I will see you for the next one.